political parties are likely to engage is within compromise as a sort of first system before going into political gridlock, before going into these kinds of things. We think that counterfactual is likely to look like a world in which you have far more different ideologies competing for dominance, or one dominant radical political ideology. I'll explain in constructive why both of those are worse. Why is political centrism the most morally legitimate political ideology? The reason more moderate policy is good in principle is because every individual in society, regardless of where they're from, possesses equal moral worth, and it is impossible for any individual to adjudicate between them in terms of said moral worth, insofar as we lack epistemic access to those individuals' preferences and thus have no way to morally adjudicate between them. Insofar as this is true, and we cannot determine in an objective sense what the most morally valuable ideology and identity is, a moderate political and regulatory environment is one we claim which provides the most possible avenues for people to express themselves in terms of their identity and in terms of their political perspective. The reason this is true is quite intuitive. Firstly, moderate policy tends to be the least polarizing, i.e. radical policy will always piss off a significant segment of the electorate who is hostile to it, either because it is aberrant to their political beliefs or because it represents a drastic departure from status quo. Secondly, radical policies or competing policy perspectives always lead to some people being shut out. This looks like in a socialist state, business owners being entirely disenfranchised in the worst case and unable to express themselves by forming a startup or engaging in a capitalist endeavor, or in a hyper-capitalist, highly deregulated environment, workers having no leverage over the means of production whatsoever. So these types of policies necessarily disenfranchise large segments of the electorate at any point. Thirdly, when you have multiple competing political perspectives that are not centrism, this can often lead to wild oscillations in terms of policy making that shut out people from being able to express themselves in identitarian or political terms. I.e., if you started in a low-tax, highly xenophobic environment that benefits the white middle class under somebody like Trump that harms minorities, to a radically redistributive policymaking environment under a hypothetical President AOC that would hurt the middle class and benefit minorities, it is likely that you see divergences and oscillations in policy that harm and benefit different groups at selective endeavors and make it hard for either group to ultimately benefit or attain their conception of the good life. The comparative is incredibly simple. Moderate policy has three key characteristics that make it better in this regard principally. Firstly, it is less likely, on balance, to interfere with expressions of identity to a minimal extent as possible. This is because, insofar as the vast majority of people in society make up the electorate but then vote for moderate policy is likely to take into account as wide a divergence in between those perspectives as possible, and therefore not unduly punish or scrutinize a particular identity or a particular characteristic. But secondly, insofar as it does neither, it is likely to move towards an environment over time that is most conducive to self-expression, insofar as this kind of laissez-faire environment is likely to be the kind of one where you have the least stricture about expression. But moreover, I just think the vast majority of people have moderate instincts, and the reason this is true is that most people intuitively tend to defer to live and let live instincts insofar as they themselves recognize they lack the judgment to pass judgment on other people's lifestyle. But they also tend to prefer continuity in terms of instability. But finally, even if some people's preferences are not taken perfectly into account, I think the vast majority of people are better off, because what radical policy does on the comparative is it tends to be super repressive and stops other people from pursuing their preferences per the intuition pumps I've already talked about. So even if moderate policy isn't the most morally good ideology in theory, in practice, other ideologies preclude the ability for self-expression to a significantly greater degree. For those reasons, we think moderate policy is better principally. Why do we get more and better policy that benefits citizens? Secondly, the reason this argument is important is twofold. Firstly, even if opposition can debunk my principle and prove in theory that there's a better policy that in practice in principle that they could implement, in practice they will be unable to. But secondly, more impactfully, the state has a moral obligation to provide benefits for its citizens insofar as it exercises an absolute monopoly of violence over people. You cannot opt out of the state system, and you cannot ever escape it. Insofar as what the likely counterfactual is going to be, we think the likely counterfactual is likely to be gridlock as a result of multiple competing platforms that stymies the capacity for states to make change in a positive manner. Why? Note that in a world where you have multiple competing political ideologies, the incentive of parties that embrace one political ideology is to not compromise at any point with the other party, because that's seen as defection from a moral and political ideology, and they are worried about being primaried by their political rivals, and they're worried about, being held to account by their own party. But secondly, there is always an incentive when you hold a radically divergent viewpoint from the other party to overturn policy passed by the previous administration in order to win political victory. This incentive exists symmetrically. The incentive is significantly less impactful when there is a broad consensus that centrist political ideology is the morally correct one and the one that most parties in the state adhere to. But thirdly, there's always internal pressure to not capitulate to other parties from your own party, which puts pressure on you and preemptively stops you from agreeing. What are the problems with this? Firstly, I think it slows down the passage of policy a lot. Insofar as many people live paycheck to paycheck and need state intervention in order to establish a livelihood or in order to take advantage of the ability to live within a state, we think slowing down the passage of policy is incredibly harmful because it hurts the ability for these people to access their conception of the good life and access benefits from the state via the passage of policy that they voted into office in the first place. But secondly, when policy interventions do happen, there's less continuity of policy between them because insofar as there are multiple ideologies within power, they're more liable to being overturned at any point, and this oscillation of policy is quite harmful. But thirdly, it's harder to course correct for bad policy because competing ideologies and unwillingness to compromise means that parties don't have the capacity to admit defeat to the same degree because they're afraid of being primaried, because they're afraid of being held to account. This is going to be harder to form coalitions in multi-party environments and things like this. Before I go on, closing.
Yeah, just this is a clarification to be clear. Moderation is not what the debate is about. It's about centrism, which is dependent on a particular political context and the biases the people have within them. You can't fiat that.
Yeah, no, I know, and I think centrism is good insofar as it takes into account the broadest possible preferences of the broadest possible amount of society. Already clarified that at the top. Moving on, we also, what was the comparative then? Firstly, there's a lower barrier to political collaboration. This means you get more compromise and there is a less fear of being held to account internally by your own primary or being primaried by a radical politician at every point. But secondly, it being the dominant political ideology norm means that deviations from this norm are more likely to be called out. But thirdly, you just get faster policy at every point. So even in theory, if they could get better policy in some instances, that policy is less responsive to circumstances on the ground and less likely to be held to account and less likely to go through a lot of testing and rigorous compromise, thereby becoming more moderate and thereby ultimately helping more people actualize their preferences. If it's one dominant political ideology that shuts tons of people out from the political process, that's bad. The final claim I want to make, here's why we encourage race in the media and dampen radicalism. The reason this is good and not in tension with our principles is that radical ideology makes it harder for the maximum number of people to express their ideology. What we do is we disincentivize a race to the bottom in terms of political ideology by politicians because the incentive in status quo is to one-up each other by becoming more radical. We get stronger safeguards to prevent that from happening, by which politicians now have experienced an active electoral cost by becoming more radical rather than moving to the middle. We get stronger safeguards against radicals and stronger political establishments to stop people like Trump and people like Orban from ever running in the first place, and stronger political safeguards to make these things happen less frequently. Because we proved on the principle and proved on the practical. Incredibly proud to stand in opening gov.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech. I now welcome up the first opposition speaker, the leader of the opposition, to deliver an address not exceeding 7 minutes. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The stance from opening opposition is very clear. We support political pluralism. We don't want to restrict people's choice. We want people to access every sort of ideology on the political spectrum that is available to them. 3 arguments from opening opposition. First, why political centrism restricts individuals' democratic preferences and freedom. Second, why political centrism leads to worse radicalism and extremism. And third, why political centrism leads to worse policy outcomes. Note all 3 arguments are on clash with the opening government, so responses are weaved within. Firstly, why political centrism restricts individuals' democratic preferences. Here, I just want to use the principled metric that PM themselves set up in their case, that there is no correct moral or political ideology, and as a result, we should respect everyone's political or moral ideology. What I find fascinating by opening government is that their principal argument that they say is not contingent on practical outcomes, then proceeded to be contingent on the practicality of moderate policy as something that is better than any other policy. So this idea that their principle is not contingent on a practical was actually completely contingent on any sort of practical outcome, insofar as their entire reasoning was based on how much more practically efficient it was if the entire world was moderate. So on a weighing metric of principality, like, you can't consider opening government insofar as they use practical mechanisms in order to support their principle. But secondly, the line from opening opposition on this argument is just to say that the purpose of democracy is to give people a matrix or a plethora of options, not just a vote on the ballot box, but a sufficient vote that reveals to everyone what their preferences are. That necessarily people should have maximum choice democratically as to what they want in their country, and you should not be limiting as a state or a government the choices that people see on the ballot box. Why is this incredibly important? Because we posit that the purpose of democracy is that people get to have a say in what they want and what happens in the state. That say is restricted by opening government when necessarily that ballot box is limited to a scope, which means that it only happens in the center. What is the weighing that you have to do on a principle here, Judge? The opening government metric for principle is self-expression, and that moderate policy means that you can self-express to a greater degree. The principled metric that opening opposition uses is that you get better choice and better autonomy to accept your choices, accept your democratic preferences. Why do you prefer opening opposition's metric on the principle? We posit that the choice of democratic freedom means you're better able to self-express yourself in the long term or just anywhere, insofar as when you see something that you agree with on the ballot box, it doesn't need to be centrist, it doesn't need to be moderate. That is when you're better able to self-express your democratic preference. So even on the metric of self-expression, opening opposition win because we prefer choice. What we posit secondly is that the nature of politics worsens necessarily when you get less engagement. This is when necessarily politics gets far worse, insofar as, for example, when you're engaging in bipartisan politics, you have to be far more bland. You can't use emotions. That's when necessarily people are going to be more turned out from politics. We want people to go to the ballot box. People are not going to go to the ballot box when politics becomes extremely bland, extremely boring, when it becomes bipartisan. We don't want politics to become incredibly moderate and incredibly centrist, insofar as people are going to be turned away when they see no change happening, when their vote isn't illustrated on the ballot box. It's not enough to assert that most people are moderate. We want to express the democratic preferences that everyone has, not just the select few that opening government want. Second argument on why you get worse radicalism. Here the context is that radical ideologies and politicians exist in either world. But secondly, more importantly, they probably have support or sway on either side of the house. This is incredibly important because in opposition's world, these radical politicians operate outside of the mainstream political discourse and debate. Why is this an issue? I want to note two things. One, it means that the instances of echo chambers or people going down rabbit holes or people just following more extremist ideology outside of the mainstream establishment is much more likely necessarily when you disengage from mainstream discourse. Why? Because the moment you see something that is outside of mainstream discourse, that is done, by example, from a radical politician, that is when you're much less likely to turn back to mainstream discourse, because it is that exact extreme politician that is telling you that the mainstream media, the mainstream politicians are useless, ludicrous, etc. And as a result, you're not going to go back. But secondly, I would posit that the narrative disrupts democracy. Why? Because the moment you become anti or disestablishmentarianism, that's when you're more likely to disrupt, disevolve, disengage from democracy. That worsens it. So why do you get worse radicalism? Insofar as you're outside of the political or mainstream political discourse, radical ideologies are far more pervasive and far more worse for you as a nation. I'll take up your wife from closing if they have one, but if not, opening.
The problem with this argument is that insofar as radicalism exists on either side, you have significantly less strictures and safeguards that prevent those radicalism from taking hold, while simultaneously you make it far harder for the maximum number of people to express their preferences because of the oscillations in the policy environment that make it harder for any one policy to help people.
Let's assume that more radicalist views are heard on our side of the house. The issue is when it operates within the mainstream political debate. That's when people are able to compare it to just moderate or centrist policies that you yourself prefer. If that is the case, that moderate and centrist policies are better for you as a population, or people will see that it is better, then you're better able to check against the extremism and radicalism when it's confined to, as you say, the strictures of mainstream political discourse. That's when it's far better for you as a nation when the radicalism and the extremism happens within the mainstream political discourse, because then you can correct it within that. There is no stricture, there is no regulation in government's world when the extremism and radicalism happens completely outside of the sphere of politics. Finally, why do you get worse policy outcomes? I just think it's incredibly difficult to find common ground for a few reasons. Why? You still need to win over voters. So the idea that you're going to be able to agree on things and get small incremental change is just confusing to me, insofar as you're probably going to make fake promises and fake deals that necessarily mean that you might say that you're working together, but really you're not. But two, the method in which you use to pursue some sort of change in society, even if it is true that you want to agree on the outcome, often politicians are unable to agree on the method they use to achieve that outcome. That's where the differences in political ideology come from. But third, most importantly, some policies and some issues in society are necessarily unexplainable or unconceivable for both sides to work together and come to an agreement. As a result, it's incredibly unclear the mechanism from opening government that they would use to find a solution on this matter. There's no positive analysis done by PM as to why they are actually going to be successful in finding policy outcomes instead of just asserting that they will be able to find incremental change. I would posit you get worse policy outcomes because it's impossible to find common ground on issues that are prevalent in society, issues that people are no longer going to see on the ballot box. For those reasons, incredibly proud to oppose.
All right, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver an address not exceeding 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
Hey, am I audible?
Yep.
Hello?
Yep. Can you hear me? Yep.
I can't hear anything. Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Oh, wait, sorry, I muted the audio. Say something.
Yes. Hi.
Yes, okay, I can hear you. Fantastic.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I can hear you too.
Sorry about that. For POIs, put them in the chat. Don't verbally interrupt. I'll let you know when I'm ready to take you. Just making sure I'm visible. Great. I think I have 20 more seconds based on the world's manual. Great. With that being said, getting my timer out. 3, 2, 1. It's hard to know what is right if you aren't willing to listen to those who couldn't be right. I'm going to do a few things in this deputy and make it very clear why Matt won you the debate already from PM. First thing I'm going to do is weigh on political pluralism. Why is it more likely to exist on our side? Why must this be the dominant ideology that exists and not just some amorphous arena where anything can rise to the top? First thing I want to make clear, extreme ideology still exists. We just need this one as a pressure valve and a barrier and a security to make sure other ones don't necessarily take over to hinder political pluralism. Why will other ideologies still exist where this is the dominant ideology? One, there's an emphasis here on open-mindedness and bipartisanship via the wording of the info slide itself. Secondarily, people are still curious to an extent to explore other ideas. And thirdly, there's still some minority of passionate individuals for any one ideology that exists. The upshot here is that we're not actually crowding out these ideologies. Why is it bad not to have this one as a dominant ideology and have this amorphous arena? In addition to the things that Matt told you, a few things. One, ideologies become zero-sum insofar as one rising to the top now means that it or removes the one that it is competing against. This creates an incentive and a capacity to become more antagonistic and shut out other ideas so they don't monopolize the space that you want to enter. But this dominant ideology acts as a barrier to that no one ideology can become a dominant ideology. Secondarily, people themselves think they should not listen to the other side or vote for other politicians or have discourse with others because it's a moral and egoistic slight compared to a norm that encourages that discussion because one should reach across the aisle. What is the implication of this? It's likely that pluralism cannot take place on their side, and if it can, it only becomes antagonistic and not searching for truth within that own ideology, rather trying to demonize another ideology. The upshot of this is that you are most likely to maximize the opportunity for various preference fulfillment on our side and self-expression and choice. And note, this is divorced from the benefits of moderate policy. I want to be very clear, just because Matt ran two things doesn't mean one cannot be independent of the benefits of the other. But secondly, that there are still the benefits of advancement and innovation in those ideologies, because I've proven to you they still exist, just without the threat of shutting out those of other ideologies. Secondarily, why is centrism more likely to promote moderation? Note the analysis Matt gave you in the previous analysis I just gave, but secondarily, the info site literally says it, favoring moderate policies. But thirdly, you must reach across the aisle in order to get those to otherwise vote for you. But to fourthly note that they are more receptive to reaching across the aisle because you know that the starting premise of everyone else is that they will listen to you or that it is a dominant ideology that will compel others to listen to you. The more preferences you have to take into account at any point, the more likely you move to moderation as a response to having to incorporate more of those preferences, fulfilling Matt's principle again. Now, I want to do something very important here. Why is it still likely that this moderate ideology still bends toward justice, if it is something that can be known over time and something you can presume exists, and that is something we should move towards with our policies. One note, old norms die out as people themselves die. Old norms and ideologies. Secondarily, young people and new generations like to challenge the previous establishment as they establish their own selves in the world, i.e. the rebelliousness of youth. But thirdly, and this is critically, what is most just tends to be most persuasive and becomes persuasive as the argument for it is honed and more people listen. That is to say, anti-slavery, anti-segregation, while yes, had extremists pushing for it that helped advance it, was never an immediate thing that was done. It took decades and centuries for people to come to understand and internalize that justification. In a world where there could be no dominant ideology or no dominant form of centrism, it is clear that the powers that be that want to prevent that kind of advancement from happening will shut out the potential for it to exist. But when there is no one winner that can monopolize that arena, there's the potential for the right argument and what is just to come to the forefront. Secondly, weighing on why the extreme ideologies are more likely to bend towards the bad and harmful things than the good things that could promote the stuff that opposition wants. It's more likely the potential to be devastating than positive and remarkable. Why? Harmful ideologies that are based on division and hate spread faster than the ones based on good things like empathy. Why? One, politics is a response to social problems. When something is a problem hurting people, they are scared, they're worried, they're subject to panic. Their worse, not better natures take over when they have to pick between two extremes as opposed to a moderate option. Secondarily, it's a biological human response to a problem is to be individualistic and not trusting of others. The harmful ideologies tend to be the most individualistic ones that tell you don't trust the other people, kill them if you have to because they might kill you, so you don't become empathetic in those situations. Thirdly, harmful things tend to take more attention in news because these vitriolic statements capture people's attentions more than things like love and flowers. And fourthly, it is easier for someone to be against something than to be for something positive. I.e., someone is more mad when they've lost $10 than if they found $10 on the street. Why? Because it's based on the expectations that you have. Someone does not expect to find $10, but they expect not to lose their $10 that they otherwise already have. Before weighing moderate and slow advancement over the extreme and potential for gridlock that otherwise exists, i.e. a lot of the material that Matt gave you, I would like to take a POI from CO very quickly.
So notably, only one of your mechanisms for liberalization was related to centrism, and it was an assertion. Given that in the context of liberalization and broad trends, how does this fall into the rest of the debate?
One note, it wasn't just one mechanism. We gave a plethora of other reasons for why it's likely to be moderation, but also see my previous analysis for why it's likely to lead to moderate policy. But then the secondary analysis for I gave why it's likely to be more liberalized moderate policies, as opposed to the counterfactual, more extreme conservative vitriolic policies are more likely to accrue when you have a amorphous arena where not one dominant idea or one dominant ideology is allowed to take over that isn't centrism. Great. Now weighing on moderate and slow advancement over extreme and the potential for gridlock. One note that you get less consistent policy if it is extreme, even if it is the good policy, which means any potential advancement on their side is immediately revoked next time a different party might come into power. So even if their advancement might come quicker, it is actually in the long term less likely to sustain itself insofar as people are likely to revoke that because they are less willing to go across the aisle. So they shut out the aisle when they get the chance. But secondarily, less stable governments, which means it's easier to form coalitions in a multi-party system or agree on legislation when competition is comparatively less zero-sum. The upshot is that it makes it substantially harder to be representative because it's merely antagonistic to the other side. But secondarily, you get far better urgency in response to key issues and better policy outcomes. But finally, the discussion becomes about reaching the right policy and the true right and just way to govern society. Why? Because you're about reaching across the aisle to try to get to the actual right goal. Compared to the counterfactual, where if there's no dominant ideology, you only benefit from being antagonistic because the other ideology might shut you out across the aisle. I think it is very clear that one should keep an open mind and embrace moderate policy on our side.
Okay, excellent. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to deliver an address not exceeding 7 minutes. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Cool, sorry. I'm going to address 4 different things in this speech. I'm going to begin with new material about how we heighten the level of political engagement in the system. Secondly, I'm going to flip the entirety of OG on extremism within politics. Thirdly, I'll talk about quality of policy. Finally, I'll address the OG principle. In terms of engagement, now, a plausible government claim is that their side is likely to engage people to a greater extent because people don't feel a priori apathetic and turned off when they see the political system otherwise representing multiple different viewpoints. They're likely to become disillusioned. There are two ways that we flip this argument and make it offense for our side. One, it is more likely that, especially in the developing world, their side sees a greater degree of shutting out minorities within the political system. Why? Because under the status quo, or in a world where pluralism is more dominant, there's a more diversified range of viewpoints within the political system. And what that means is that especially disenfranchised minorities are more likely to be listened to. You see political parties, a la the Workers' Party in Brazil, emerging to cater to and to protect such minorities, since it is more of a norm for political parties to cater to a broader sort of array of preferences that individuals may have. That then creates competition to cater to such minority groups within the political system. However, in a world where political parties cater primarily to the median voter, more likely to be a relatively privileged or even just middle-class individual, political parties have fewer incentives to cater to people who are on the outside of the political system, progressive groups who are asking for changes in the system. And what does that mean? They don't craft policies which cater to minorities to the same extent because the dominant political parties already feel secure in their voting base, and therefore the competitive incentives don't kick in. But secondly, centrism doesn't exclusively apply on the national level, like OG weirdly assumes. In a world where centrism is dominant, local politics also move toward the center. But that's bad, because even in areas where individuals' preferences are more likely to converge and be intense, like ethnic enclaves, the politicians who rise to the top and get endorsements within regional political party networks are the ones who move to the center and therefore shut out those more extreme politicians. And they're the ones who are likely also going to have the capital from larger political party networks. The strategic implication of this material is that their side significantly underweights minority voices and increases the apathy that GovBench might talk about. There are several reasons this is sufficient to outweigh the OG principle, even if you think the OG principle is well proven in its entirety. One, OG is right that all individuals have unique moral worth and that individuals all have valid political preferences. However, what they miss is that individuals have varying degrees of strength in their political preferences. Our claim is that even if we see a move toward the extremes, we ought to cater to the intensity of democratic preferences of minorities. For example, people may have for instance, white middle-class people may have a desire to see lower taxes, but that preference is relatively small and mild in comparison to the more intense desire of smaller minority communities who want to vote on police or prison reform, or the poor who relied on food stamps. Now, DPM says this is a question about what is more just. We should create policy which finds what is more just, but the pace of finding policy which is actually more just for individuals is faster under our side because the individuals who are more likely to promote progressive ideologies outside of the political system are better enabled to get into the political system when they can appeal to relatively more radical political parties and be integrated into the political system that way. This way, we can figure out and have more democratic deliberation and discussion about what is good and to cater to such preferences. But also on a principled level, we have a reparative obligation to cater to minorities to a more significant extent. If you are a Muslim in India, you face consistent threats to your life, and the condition you are in is one for which the government is directly responsible, and therefore it owes you a reparative obligation to correct for that condition you are in. But thirdly, people feel represented to a greater extent under our side. We think that's good trivially in terms of mobilizing more people. A precondition to any sort of democratic good governance that they want is people being enfranchised and feeling like they will be heard in the first place. Secondly, on extremism, the starting point of OG's claim is that they disincentivize a race to the bottom among politicians because there is a greater cost to being extreme. In the meta, I just want to point out that they don't actually explain what the actual cost to that extremity is. But our claim is that when centrism is the norm, it is more likely that you see bad types of extremism. Why? Because it's easier for populists to use the rhetoric that the entire establishment is colluding with one another. They can point to things like the neoliberal convergence among parties which remain in the center. What that means is that you get even more politicians like Bolsonaro who rail against institutions, packed courts, attempt to rewrite constitutions against individuals' democratic will because they came to power on the explicit rhetoric that the entire establishment is bad. Comparatively, even if we also have extreme views, the types of extreme extreme views we have on our side are better because politicians don't rail against the establishment to the same extent, because it is more normalized to see a greater range of views, and therefore it is harder for any one politician to call the establishment shit. So in their nature, it is more customary for political parties further to the extremes to emerge, and those political parties then exist as institutions to rein in the otherwise extreme politicians. So the endpoint of this analysis is maybe we have more extremism on our side, but the quality of it is better. We're more likely to see a Bernie Sanders figure versus a Trump figure. Before I move on, CG.
Question?
Yep.
Even if you prove in theory moderates deserve less representation than radicals, which you don't, because the logical implication of this is we should weigh racist votes higher because they have intense feelings about minorities too, it's harder for policy passage on your side to happen in the first place. You get more diluted, less diluted policy.
That's it. Okay, so one, obviously in terms of like racist preferences, that's obviously an illegitimate democratic preference. We're happy to draw the line there. But two, as I point out, these individuals are ones to whom we have a reparative obligation. We don't have a reparative obligation to racists. Thirdly, on quality of politics, quality of policy. Now, the DPM emphasizes that we ought to work with other people, that they see a greater degree of cooperation under our side. But the emphasis that they talk about is on working with people within the center who have relatively similar beliefs. Obviously, as PM even argues when they say that extreme ideas are called out, more extreme ideas will be stigmatized, since specifically the moderate policies are favored. And those are the ones that political parties say are ones with which you could compromise. By contrast, why is it that we still get better cooperation under our side? Because contrary to what OG claims, political parties still want to work with others on our side and are worried about their legacies. But it is better that we further negotiate policies rather than quickly converging on generic policies. So even if the pace of policy we get is slower, we get broader slices of coalitions which represent individuals' interests. And it's not to one like they claim, where it's just like, oh, sometimes people win, sometimes people lose. It's like different policies based on different interests that individuals have all now get implemented on our side because you represent a greater range of people. This therefore flips their principle and explains why the type of convergence you get is likely to stifle individuals' democratic preferences. Very proud to owe out.
Okay, I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and I now welcome up the Member of Government to open up the bottom half of this debate. Hear.
The extension we're going to bring to you today in Closing Government is that the individual politicisation of people makes them sad and makes them think that the world is going in a bad direction and doesn't give them a good livelihood. First, though, some quick rebuttal to opening opposition on minorities. I think when they say that minority voices with intense beliefs will promote that belief in their world, they'll probably promote it in our world as well. But notice, when identity politics is not required to justify extreme ideology that the majority of people don't necessarily understand, don't engage with, and don't agree with, it's more plausible that minority issues aren't so polarized and aren't so difficult to get listened to and talked about because they don't impact the majority of people. So they can pass with cooperation without huge backlash based on identity politics that we see under the status quo. So we think that the necessity of having identity politics by having a lack of a centre in politics under the status quo is part of the reason why minority voices are not listened to. That doesn't happen in our world. Why then do we think individual politicisation makes people have worse lives on net? Under the status quo, we think individuals are over-politicised and there's an ideology-based system that doesn't suit the majority. Firstly, the status quo is one of people being forced into having an opinion, where people from that form their identity around their politics, their community, that sort of thing. Secondly, we think a wide swathe of the population are constantly involved and aware of a political system of 24-hour news where politics invades your whole life because you see the other side as evil, you see it as dangerous, you see the future as tenuous and you see everything on the line because that is what you are being told is happening constantly. You are scared about your future. You are scared about the quality of other people in the world because you genuinely think it's kind of evil what other people believe and what their moral compasses are. Why do we think that happens under the status quo? Two things. Firstly, we think it is a consequence of the lack of a centre. Why? Because to justify fundamentally extreme and unintuitive ideology that most people don't read, most people don't care about, and most people don't engage with, like that of, I don't know, the US Republican Party, where the majority of their policies aren't actually popular, you have to tie politics to identity and demonize the opposition. Notice it's not about people's policy preferences and genuine consent into politics and policy, but it's about seeing identity as something that is part of your politics. It looks like focusing on who you are as an individual and relating everyone to that party rather than talking about policy, rather than talking about that ideology as a whole. It looks like demonizing the opposition so that you will never be able to vote for them because you genuinely think they are evil and that they have a horrible view of the world. Secondly, we think the extremity of politics and the sense of fighting an evil opposition makes engagement with news networks and politics addictive because you genuinely feel like that there's a lot on the line. You want to see what's going on. It's weirdly enjoyable, but also horrible for your mental health to spend your whole time on Twitter, spend huge amounts of time reading the news, to be engaged in so much that's going on in the world that doesn't actually impact you, the majority of which doesn't impact your daily life, but you have this view of the world as going in a negative direction, as being dangerous, as being harmful to individuals. You strike fear in people, whether you're the government or the opposition, because you believe that's the best way to keep people on your side. Why is that so rubbish for individuals? Three reasons. Firstly, we think your day-to-day life is just much worse for the majority of people because your perception of the world is much more negative. You wake up in the morning and think the world is going in the wrong direction. You wake up in the morning and don't have faith in your future. You wake up in the morning and don't have hope. And that's both if you are for the government that's happening or the government that isn't happening, because the necessity of demonizing the opposition, of demonizing other parties and seeing everything as on the line is part of the extremities of politics today. Secondly, we think it harms your relationships with other people. We think there are families that are genuinely broken up by political ideologies that people don't care that much about, that don't impact their lives that much, and the genuine joy that you get out of family relationships, of like meeting other people and enjoying their company, the genuine joy and the importance that it has to your daily life is diluted and destroyed when politics becomes something so central to your identity and you cannot engage with those other people. When something like the Brexit vote means that families don't speak to each other for years, that is something that genuinely harms people in a level that we think the majority of policy does not. It is their emotional and like situational life. Thirdly, we think that you skew preferences towards worse policy because you have no choice. You have to keep voting for this party because it's part of your identity. You have to keep voting for this party because you see the other side as demonized. And this consent is skewed by this haze of fear and ideology, which most often you didn't choose but were grown up into and indoctrinated into. Sure, I'll take a POI from opening.
Our side incentivizes coalition building since all political parties have sizable voter bases. On your side, there's a lower risk to politicians demonizing minorities when they don't need to cater to such minorities.
Well, I just don't think that's true, because if you even look at the info slide, it's talking about how cooperation is central to centrism, right? So if you're going to have cooperation in our world, and that's literally the definition that is given in the info slide, we think it means you're much less likely to demonize people, because if you say that person is horrible and evil and then strike a deal with them next day, you're probably not going to look particularly good to your voter base. So we think it necessarily means that it takes away the necessity to demonize other people. Why then do we think centrism changes that? Why it takes out the fire and the anger in politics that harms people's perceptions of the world and their hope in the future? Firstly, on seeing cooperation, which I've already mentioned in response to that POI, but genuinely, if you're a politician, you can't make the opposition look horrible if cooperation is central to your ideology and central to what you're about to do in policy. But secondly, we think when policy changes less drastically, when there are less extreme policies being put on the table, there isn't that fear and weird excitingness of being on Twitter, because politics is less central to every day. Your outlook of the future is less negative when you don't think that everything is on the line, when you think it's about like roads, right? Rather than about like the soul of democracy, the soul of the nation. Thirdly, we just think sometimes it's somewhat less interesting, right? And we think that's probably a good thing, because we don't think that people are necessarily political figures. We don't think people should spend their lives thinking about politics. It is a horrible thing for your mental health. It is a horrible thing for how you look at the status quo. And we think that practical questions are much more important. In our world, we think that politics is thought about when needed rather than like thought about constantly. When you see a pothole, when you see that your local school needs more books, it's still important. It's just not an ideology-based way that you look at the entire world. When the politicization of individuals decreases, the polarization of how you view people decreases, and you can live a life that isn't seeped with this hatred and this view of the world as an evil place. And maybe it's not a whole societal shift, but given the media reflects the majority of people, and we think a huge number of people take on this ideology, we think it makes a huge difference in every aspect of people's lives when their outlook on the future and their outlook on the state of their nation changes. Proud to propose.
Okay, excellent. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the member of opposition to deliver an address not exceeding 7 minutes. Here.
Perfecto. Just a sec. The government teams in this debate have indeed contended with the possible harms of ideology, but they have not contended with the fact that this motion asks them to prove that the answer to ideology is more ideology. The comparative in this debate is not political centrism, does it exist or not, is whether or not we support it as a dominant political ideology. We say it will remain at least as a non-dominant ideology, but probably more just as a general value which people may hold to a small degree, though admittedly it will be secondary or even in politics because of norms and ideas of aspirations where you have where we cooperate, we coexist. Sure, we won't agree on the final conclusion, but we will at least have a discussion first, being specifically noting the DPM material on the idea that not having centrism as dominant necessarily means the comparative is like no discourse allowed, nothing happening. Obviously, that is not the comparison intended within this debate. But another reason why that wouldn't is partially because of some of the potential concerns that the government teams have raised in this debate. The idea that some degree of centrism is perhaps valuable in itself, and thus we say it is likely to remain. I want to note here that this means people can still vote for them, OG. There's no ideas of your votes or like your epistemic access preferences not being known means that there's an inherent moral harm, because no, they can vote for the few centrists which do exist, just if it wouldn't necessarily be a dominant ideology in and of itself, and they could just also vote for other people. I want to note, secondly, on the trend of progression which exists within the world. I'm not going to explicitly rebut the DPM material on skewing towards hate. I'm just going to make some counterclaims which are more persuasive. The first mechanism here on why over its history and over time, society gets more and more progressive and more open and liberalizing is threefold. One, we build on our knowledge. That is to say, if we know something to be the case, or to say trivially within science, we take things as a given. We find 2 + 2 = 4 and then eventually end up on crazy like proofs and formulas and these kinds of things. But separately, I would say that this can somewhat apply within politics. We build over time certain norms which we then take even further. But secondly, I would just note economic growth, right? The idea that politics and the status quo has become, so to speak, postmodern. It's no longer the idea of modern concerns of whether or not you have enough food in your plate, at least within developed countries, because a lot of people do, and therefore those people's concerns become issues of culture. You get a postmodern politic. But third of all, I want to note the idea that there's a continued expansion of empathy underpinning all of this, because as soon as the classes which we deem as people who have political control expand that at any one instance, or admit that we should care about the suffering of another group, they have to remove a criteria for being a moral actor. For example, when even say voting within the UK was open up to people who didn't own land, they admitted that people who didn't own land were an essential feature, thus pointing out that you didn't have to necessarily be extremely rich or well educated, and thus that also then led to part of the case for women's suffrage too, and further suffrage of other groups. Given this, as soon as you expand empathy at all, and it's already happened in the past, so we can expect this to continue, you open open up yourselves to more empathy and understanding of different groups over time. Given this, alongside the idea that you are able to care for these groups due to some degree of economic growth, and that you have a postmodern, and there's a postmodern politics. But secondly, because we build up on our knowledge, we think that over time we get a huge liberal trend of becoming more and more progressive. Given this, I want to talk about the irreparable harms contained within the ideology of centrism, because centrism as an ideology specifically prioritizes respectability in politics and strong institutionalism as two key negations of that which is radical. And these two features are ultimately deeply harmful. Why are both of these things reliant upon, like, why the existence of, say, respectability politics and strong institutionalism reliant on centrism being a dominant ideology, and there's just not a value which generally exists within politics, thus being more comparative than the OO on this? I want to know a few things, because we do recognize that respectability politics revolves around things that, look, that which is radical is disrespectful to the other side. That is to say that ultimately it would be disrespectful to, say, like a neoliberal to tell them private property should be abolished, because that is outside the realms of respectful debate. It is not an opinion which we should respect in and of itself. But second of all, and it would note that it means you need to treat the other side well, because you must be treated with respect, as Ahmed conceded. Given this, then, there's a certain code of conduct which you must abide to. You must wear a suit. You must use fancy language and vernacular. You must never swear. You must never be angry, unless you're a man, because you may have an excuse to be angry sometimes, and all of these things. Thus, we see respectability politics as quite built in. Separately, though, institutions can be understood as the formalization and structuring of the status quo necessary to constrain the range of possible actions to change it. This is to say, centrism emphasizes institutions because it locks in and stops any radical policy outside of centrism. The very idea of institutions and working within them is that we are working across the aisle within broad policy mechanisms which we can all agree within. Therefore, when this is a dominant ideology, we see that ultimately respectability politics is hugely emphasized because it is a mandatory norm as a code of conduct, and institutions because the only acceptable way to engage in policy making. As a value, there are other ways, and you're willing to change institutions. And separately, as a value, respectability politics can disappear to some extent, or just becomes an option as opposed to an expected norm opening.
Quite intuitively, it's easier to establish consistent norms that bend towards progressivism when there are not massive policy divergences and more inconsistency in policy.
It doesn't matter, because even if it swings for like a little bit of backsliding for a few years, the empathy which is being engendered by people agreeing that more groups should be considered over time wins out, and over time it will. I can't cut off, Ahmed. Why are you shaming me? Crucially, then, I want to note two things. A, the harms of respectability politics, because insofar as it is bound up in privilege, i.e., the codes of conduct and what is respectable to do is probably determined by the people who were within power at the time, as is the case with the institutions. We think this often sort out other things. Like, if you just don't have a posh enough vernacular, if you don't have the fancy words to describe things, if you don't have access to a suit so you can speak in the parliament, these kinds of things. But secondly, it punishes emotionality. You should not be angry. You should be respectable when engaging with your opposition. You cannot complain that they have cut off the funding to your local town viscerally. No, you must do so with a dispassionate objectivity. But separately, on institutionality, I've noted how it's rooted in the past, but I would also survey against the path dependency, thus countering good policy making. Because if we believe institutions are the only acceptable way to engage in policy, what happens when the institutions are not built, because they are historic, to account for new problems? I.e., what if there is suddenly massive deflation within the dollar? How could the Fed necessarily fix it instantly? It may not be built for this. Ultimately, we say the answer to ideology is not more ideology. I beg you to oppose.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the government whip speaker to deliver an address not exceeding 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
Hi, thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Thank you. Just 1 second. I'm going to take it team by team, starting with OO, then CO, then OG. We get three main pushes into this debate from OO. And the first one is just like this idea about radicalization and why it's so much worse on our side of the house. And I think like the reason I want to start with this is because I think this is potentially one of the most important harms within this debate. And I genuinely credit them with a very important like discussion point. And I think it's true that radicalization is probably going to exist on both sides of the house to an extent or another, or you're going to try to have pushes for radicalization to exist on either side of the house. So then the question naturally becomes, how do we fight it, right? And I think the only way to fight radicalization properly is by spotting it early on and preventing it, right? Because I think the function of radicalism is that once it starts, once it is ignited, it is virtually impossible to stop it, right? So the question about how to stop or address or like prevent radicalism from happening is just your capacity to see it from so early on that it doesn't get to develop in the first place. I think only in an environment where you are desensitized to this idea of like radicalization, only in an environment where seeing someone not reach across the aisle is seen as like a massive political fallacy, only in an environment where seeing people say crazy stuff is seen as the massive red flag of politics, is an environment where from very early on, when one radical politician is springing through, you can notice that politician and you can go about countering them. Comparatively, I think, on their side of the house, you're unable to spot radicalism when it is formed because everyone around you is so radical. You're literally pushing it and going down a rabbit hole of radicalism. It is incredibly difficult to spot it. And I think if you are to weigh these two based on who is best able to fight it, I think it's clearly on government side. But then second thing OO says is like the thing about maximizing choice, right? And how the purpose of democracy is this ability to give you a lot of choice, and you should be able to choose whether or not you're a centrist or a radical, right? I think like it's like literally that's not necessarily it. Like I don't think the purpose of democracy is necessarily this. I think genuinely the purpose of democracy is to give you stuff. Like it's a way for us to literally exit the state of nature and pragmatically face the challenges of a real world. I think we give up on a lot of freedom to just like gain a lot of effectiveness. And I think like the reason you should weigh a lot of the pragmatic stuff ahead of this, like, oh, you have a lot of choice, is that the only reason we have political systems in the first place is not some like incredible ideological purity thing. It's just literally existing within this world and them giving us stuff and them catering to our needs. Insofar as like we don't get stuff and we choose ideological purity over actual effectiveness, I think democracy is quite fail actually. So I don't see why that should be weighed this way. But last thing we hear from like OO is this idea that like political groups are not going to cater to minority voices, and you kind of need extremism to defend minority voices in order to get any push for them whatsoever. I think three responses here lastly. I think number one, comparatively, the status quo also massively misses catering to minorities, right? I think most minorities get close to nothing in the status quo, whereas you have a status quo of political extremism, right? Particularly because whoever is in power, by very nature of being extreme, is going to naturally leave out some people, right? Comparatively, getting more benefits for all, even if it's like less promised benefits for each individual group, but getting more benefits for them all together means that even these minorities that you're talking about are better on our side of the house. But then the final way, no thank you, towards this is the way that Katie gives you, right? I think like identity politics is the number one challenge that you have to providing minorities with a lot of useful tools and instruments that they need politics to provide them with. Insofar as you foster an environment in which this identity politics is just continued over and over again, that is the number one thing which stops you from being able to cater to those minorities, and it's just like number one bad thing which stops you from giving them effective policy. Before I move on, I'll actually take opening.
Your partner claims centrism means you never engage in personal attacks against others, yet your mitigation rests on shutting out politicians at the extremes. What we explained is that centrism is likely to be pursued in a way where you only cooperate with people in the center.
Yeah, I think like there's nothing like in opposal with this. We just both claim reasonability. Like she claims like obviously you're not going to attack people, but obviously you're going to be able to single out extremism, because singling out extremism is the best defense for everyone in society. Like I don't see a massive incompatibility there. I just think we're both quite reasonable with it. So I'm just going to move on now on CO, right? And I think we get two main pushes for CO. Number one is like, why does it have to be dominant, right? Like why does centrism have to be the main thing in society? Why can it not just be one thing? And I think the response to this is quite clear. I think unless dominant, so long as extremist forces exist, even in the slightest, they will be pulling everyone involved in their side, right? It's literally what happens in the status quo. If you analyze the past decades of politics, it's literally an emergence of more radical forces that keep getting more radical and keep trying to corrupt the center, right? The only way to avoid descent into radicalism or gridlock or extremism is to leave as little space for any sort of like extremist push possible as like ever. Like if you just have centrism as one other thing, then you're never going to have centrism centrism, and you're never going to be able to co-opt these benefits. You need it to be dominant in order to ensure that the descent into radicalism doesn't fundamentally happen. But then secondly, they say, centrism ignites a code of conduct of privilege and basically just perpetuates the status quo, and only the men in suits are going to be able to be in power. I think two responses here. Firstly, number one, it is, I think, largely symmetric. He was describing this idea about men in suits being in power. That's literally today's politics. That's literally characteristics of the status quo, which is not a situation of center politics. To an extent, I don't see what type of benefit they largely have over political centrism. But secondly, I think the solution to their problem is just applying more of the motion, right? If their problem is that the way we formulate issues is just fundamentally white and male, then presumably by reaching out more, by understanding and catering to the other side, which happens to be minorities, then that's the way to solve the very issue that they have. The only way to increase accessibility is to foster an environment where you have conversations with different types of minorities within politics. Lastly, why do I think we take it over, and why do I think its extension is fun and should win? Firstly, I think it has it should have priority and relevance in terms of humans, right? I think the reason we have created political systems is to advance individual benefits, right? And the core of individual benefits is your ability to pursue personhood without restrictions upon who you can become. The moment politics traps your identity into being something you cannot escape, you're not able to have meaningful conversations, you're just your political leaning, that is the fundamental attack upon your identity, which you're unable to escape, and which is incredibly dangerous upon the personhoods of literally everyone in society. Comparatively, when politics is just a tool, the fundamental characteristics of humans is not just which way they're leaning. That is the point at which the identity of humans flourishes. That is the point at which the very nature of the reason we have established politics, right, to give people stuff and to just allow them to just be the best versions of themselves that they can be. That is the point at which you actually achieve that. Lastly, then the second reason we have politics is because we believe in the evolution of thought and the taste and the beliefs of humans, right? The evolution of thought, note, is prerequisite to passing any sort of policy or adjusting to future demands of the world. If people are gridlocked into certain thoughts, if people just constantly reiterate what they think, are never able to escape their political leanings because they feel trapped into it, that is the point at which they're not willing to make any concessions ever. That is the point at which they're not willing to adjust to the progressing world. And that's CG, thank you.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the opposition whip to close out this round of debate. Here.
Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. In closing opposition, we say that the centre cannot hold. What do we bring? Two things. Firstly, that institutions are revered by centrism, but this shackles us to a history of oppression. And note, this is not just Supreme Courts, but social institutions like gender, Western civilization, all these kinds of dog whistles you hear extremists say. It also applies to respectability, noteworthy. And secondly, that respectability politics prevents political enfranchisement for minorities who cannot appeal to those kinds of values because they're premised on certain descriptive characteristics. Notably, opening opposition have some material on this. We have other material as well. This is more persuasive because we're able to show you how this does not exist in the absence of centrism rather than just why it exists within centrism. The responses we get are threefold. Firstly, that unless dominant, extremists will pull people to the side. I'll respond to that later. Secondly, that the code of conduct is symmetric with an appeal to the status quo, which is an assertion. I would say status quo is mostly centrist. And thirdly, that we should reach out to more people. The problem is not centrism, it's universal, not universalism, it's centrism. You're not reaching out to people like trans people in the UK, for example, who are outside the political system. They're existing to the radical premise. So with this in mind, how does this win the debate? First clash on moderation and morality. The first thing to say here is that moderation is dependent on the context of the political space it exists in, which is to say, firstly, the political enfranchisement of people, the history of, voter regulations, but also just whether or not people go out to the ballot in general. And secondly, internalized biases like history, religion, etc. These obfuscate people from their hypothetical preferences, and so no moral duties can result of it. But a premise of the aggregation of preferences is equality, because all preferences are equally valuable. Therefore, an ideology which promotes equality is an a priori good. Notably, this is the left or the progressive and liberal within society. So this should be the moral metric of this debate. We explain that people are locked in by arbitrary social factors that prevent them from, reaching out and these things, getting things from taking root. Secondly, on demonization, this is where I'll respond to closing government here. Notably, centrism still exists, and because most people are moderate, given OP government's characterization, you still have some degree of respectability within the kinds of discussions. It's just much more muted. Secondly, they talk about identity politics happening more. The problem is that identity politics supervenes on centrism, which positions a particular group of people in society as outside, as an outgroup of the political system. It just draws a circle around the centre rather than the left or the right, which means you still have outgroups within society. I also like to note that the rest of the mechanization of Phil's government, I think, unfortunately, is not related to the motion, but is related to things like the 24-hour news cycle and other things like that. Next thing then is on liberalization. Why is there a trend of liberalization over time? Well, these are Ahmed's mecs, right, which is internet access, education, etc. Average informed voter stuff, right? Everyone knows that the progression of time has been broadly liberal in a general sense. Notably, the only mechanism Ahmed gives for why centrism promotes liberalization is that the more just policies in discussion are more persuasive. This is not actually claimed in opening government. They never explained why this would be true. But even if it was true, it would be true to the extent that there were not arbitrary factors that prevented us from seeing reason. We say those arbitrary factors are firstly institutionalism, arbitrarily privileging things like, for example, the Constitution above moral discussions. We see this kind of thing with legal scholars all the time. And secondly, respectability, changing your opinion on what someone is saying based off of the manner in which they say this. These are biases which prevents individuals from actually accessing the liberalization that happens within society. They say that there is a chilling effect on discourse, but firstly, not if it's the norm. If it's a norm to be, a little bit braggadocious, a little bit incendiary in discourse, people still engage in that kind of discourse because it's more expected. But secondly, to the extent that you still want people to agree with you within society, which is to say, as I'm going to get to in political functioning later, and you still want to reach out to people across the aisle and persuade them, you just don't necessarily build that in as a universal construct of your ideology, but rather a conditional one based off of circumstances. Closing government saying more hate becomes prominent here because anger is stronger. But notably, opening government said this. Notably, anger can be righteous and lead towards discourse. There's no reason why you can't be angry while you're saying something valuable. And secondly, that'll be true on their side as well. Other mechanisms by which hate and those kinds of things become more prominent exist within political centrism as well. That's why the dominant ideology becomes one there. And it flies in the face of the broad trend of liberalization over time, which means that the conclusion from this part of the argument is that you should believe that liberalization is a trend that happens within society. Moving on to radicalism then, we say that radicals do not inherently get more power on our side. Notably, the motion is not about centrism as a political fact, but as a political ideology that is the dominant one. Opening government say most people are moderate and radical policy annoys most people. Therefore, on our side, most policies are going to be moderate, but more varied. You get Green parties, social democracies, and Catholic parties, as opposed to just one centrist party or a couple of different centrist parties. They're still within the broad trend of moderation and not radicalism. But notably, see how institutionalism reacts with this, and this is our argument here. On government, far-right radicals can hold on to harken back to a history of the social institutions of that country, like the Constitution, or just general social institutions, which trend to be being far more right, given my previous analysis, as a method of legitimating and justifying their ideology. Which means get far more political sway, but also can just not be assaulted by the political system. They're not demonized by the political system because they can hold on to that as a justification for this. The left, being the more radical in terms of being new, cannot do this. It cannot harken back to a history, some prelapsarian ideal of its own ideology. Therefore, insofar as radicals exist, they exist primarily on government, when they exist within the political system as being infiltrated by far-right activists who are powerful. Notably, this is stronger than OO's mechanism on radicalism because it's unclear the extent to which echo chambers existing outside the political system affects the political system. We explain how it infiltrates the political system in a meaningful way. Last thing to talk about is the functioning of the political system, but before I do, OG.
You need to respond to our preemptions as to why promoting radical policy does not lead to socio-political change. The far right is way weaker when there's a wide principle.
Yeah, that's perfect. It's the next thing I have. Also, I can cut you off if you make more than one POI, and you've given 12 in this debate already. So, opening government's mechanism on this is that internal pressure to not compromise and the perception of defection and a couple of others are all the premises by which you get gridlock, oscillation of policy, and radical policy being passed in a bad way. We say that the initial clauses here, the initial claims, are asserted and are, and are constructed by the fact, or are disagreed with by the fact that A, they say that most people are not radical, and B, that you have electoral incentives to pass policy, to get into government, to maintain power, to maintain incumbency, which means you're more likely to have things like collaborations and coalitions of collaborating parties representing overlapping ideologies rather than just identical ideologies. Notably, centrism is the ideology here, not the state of affairs. It still exists. Notably, given our radicalization analysis, we actually get more stability on our side in spite not being infiltrated by radicals. 4 ways in which you should weigh this in the debate. Firstly, stability is not an a priori good, because the stable oppression of minorities under stability is not a good thing. Secondly, the moral metric I just established was equality. It is the only one that's been established by this debate, and therefore you should not prefer expedience over equality in any case. Thirdly, insofar as we find solutions that don't rely on institutions and indeed can change institutions, we can react more quickly to problems, and therefore stability is something we can get easily on our side as well. And fourthly, stable devolution into fascism is worse than an unstable progressivism. Notably also, Ahmed, that manual reading is incorrect. In general then, centrism is something that supports the political institutions which have historically oppressed minorities and indeed most people within society across history. It is only when we abandon those kinds of institutions and respectability that we can pave a new path forward. Oppose.
Okay, thanks everyone for that fine debate. As you might all be aware, this is a closed round, which means that you can all head off, relax, wait for the next round. Best of luck for your next round.